is I'm gonna try to read my book that I'm supposed to be reading for school today. I'm going to be reading The Awakening by Chopin. I read one chapter, so I'm going to be starting on chapter 2. I don't know any of these people's names or how to pronounce them, so bear with me. Mrs. Pontellier's eyes were quick and bright. They were a yellowish brown, about the color of her hair. She had a way of turning them swiftly upon an object and holding them there as if lost in some inward maze of contemplation or thought. Her eyebrows were a shade darker than her hair. They were thick and almost horizontal, emphasizing the depth of her eyes. She was rather handsome than beautiful. Her face was captivating by reason of a certain frankness of expression and a contradictory subtle play of features. Her manner was engaging. Robert rolled a cigarette. He smoked cigarettes because he could not afford cigars, he said. He had a cigar in his pocket, which Mr. Pontellier had, I don't know how to say, Pontellier, I don't know, had presented him with, and he was saving it for his after-dinner smoke. This seemed quite proper and natural on his part. In coloring, he was not unlike his companion. A clean-shaven face made the resemblance more pronounced than it would have otherwise been. There rested no shadow of care upon his open countenance. Oh my God. Author's obsession with using the word countenance. Literally, Mary Shelley used it like 70,000 times in Frankenstein. But basically, countenance means like expression. If you didn't know, which I didn't before I read it a million times in Frankenstein. His eyes gathered in and reflected the light and linger what? Of a summer day. Basically, I'm gonna sound dumb reading this. Miss B reached over for a palm leaf fan that lay on the porch and began to fan herself while Robert sent between his lips light puffs from a cigarette. They chatted incessantly about the things around them, their amusing adventure out in the water. It had been assumed its entertaining aspect about the wind, the trees, the people who had gone to the cheniere, about the children playing croquet under the oaks, and the Fairfax twins, who were now performing the overture to The Poet and the Peasant. And it says, The Poet and the Peasant is a musical composition by the Austrian Franz Suppe, known as a composer of operettas. Robert talked a good deal about himself. He was very young and did not know any better. Miss B talked a little about herself for the same reason. Each was interested in what the other said. Robert spoke of his intention to go to Mexico in the autumn, where fortune awaited him. He was always intending to go to Mexico, but some way never got East and who had engaged herself to be married. Robert was interested and wanted to know what manner of girls her sisters were, what the father was like, and how long the mother had been dead. When Mrs. P. folded the letter, it was time for her to dress for the early dinner. "I see Leonce isn't coming back. Leonce isn't coming back," she said, with a glance in the direction whence her husband had disappeared. Robert supposed he was not, as there were a good many New Orleans clubmen over at Klein's. When Miss B. left him to enter her room, the young man descended the steps and strolled over to the croquet players, where during the half hour before dinner he amused himself with the little P. children, Pontelier, children who were very fond of him. Chapter 3. It was 11 o'clock that night when Mr. B. returned from Klein's hotel. He was in excellent humor, in high spirits, and very talkative. His entrance awoke his wife, who was in bed and fast asleep when he came in. He talked to her while he undressed, taking her anecdotes and bits of news and gossip that he had gathered during the day. From his trousers pockets he took a fistful of crumpled banknotes and a good deal of silver coins, which he piled on the bureau indiscriminately with keys, knife, handkerchief, and whatever else happened to be in his pockets. She was overcome with sleep and answered him with little half-utterances. He thought it very discouraging that his wife, who was the sole object of his existence, evinced so little interest in things which concerned him, and valued so little in his conversation. Mr. B. had forgotten his bonbons and peanuts for the boys. What is a bonbon? Does anybody know? Notwithstanding, he loved them very much, and went into the adjoining room where they slept to take a look at them, and make sure that they were resting comfortably. The result of this investigation was far from satisfactory. He turned and shifted the youngsters about in bed. One of them began to kick and talk about a basket full of crabs. Mr. B. returned to his wife with the information that Raoul had a high fever and needed looking after. Then he lit a cigar and went. Oh, why am I so bad at reading? Then he lit a cigar and went and sat near the open door to smoke it. Mrs. B. was quite sure that Raoul had no fever. He had gone to bed perfectly well, she said, and nothing had ailed him all day. Mr. B. was too well acquainted with fever symptoms to be mistaken. He assured her that the child was consuming at that moment in the next room. He reproached his wife with her inattention and her habitual neglect of the children. If it was not a mother's place to look after her children, whose on earth was it? He himself had his hands full with the brokerage business. He could not be in two places at once, making a living for his family on the street and staying at home to see that no harm befell them. He talked in a monotonous, insistent way. Miss B. sprang out of bed and went into the next room. She soon came back and sat on the edge of the bed, leaning her head down on the pillow. She said nothing and refused to answer her husband when he questioned her. When his cigar was smoked, he went to bed, and in half a minute he was fast asleep. Miss B. was by that time thoroughly awake. She began to cry a little and wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her peignoir, which is a robe in French. Blowing out the candle, which her husband had left burning, she slipped her bare feet into a pair of satin mules slippers in French. Oh, I didn't know that. At the foot of the bed, and went out on the porch, where she sat down in the wicker chair and began to rock gently to and fro. It was then past midnight. The cottages were all dark. A single faint light gleamed out from the hallway of the house. That's kind of like in The Great Gatsby. There was no sound abroad except the hooting of an old owl, also The Great Gatsby, at the top of Water Oak, and the everlasting voice of the sea that was not uplifted at the soft hour. It broke like a mournful lullaby upon the night. The tears came so fast to Mrs. B.'s eyes that the damp sleeve of her peignoir no longer served to dry them. She was holding the back of her chair with one hand. Her loose sleeve had slipped almost to the shoulder of her uplifted arm. Turning, she thrust her face, steaming and wet, into the bend of her arm and went on crying there, not caring any longer to dry her face, her eyes, her arms. She could not have told why she was crying. Such experiences as the foregoing were not uncommon in her married life. They seemed never before to have weighed much against the abundance of her husband's kindness and a uniform devotion, which had come to be tacit and self-understood. An indescribable oppression which seemed to generate in some unfamiliar part of her consciousness filled her whole being with a vague anguish. It was like a shadow, like a mist passing across her soul's summer day. It was strange and unfamiliar. It was a mood. She did not sit there inwardly upbraiding her husband, lamenting at fate which had just directed her footsteps to the path which they had taken. She was just having a good cry, all to herself. The mosquitoes made merry over her, biting her firm, round arms and nipping at her bare insteps. What? The little stinging, buzzing imps succeeded in dispelling a mood which might have held her there in the darkness half a night longer. The following morning, Mr. B was up in good time to take the Rockaway, a light, low, four-wheeled, horse-drawn carriage, which was to convey him to the steamer at the wharf. He was returning to the city to his business, and they would not see him again at the island till the coming Saturday. He had regained his composure, which seemed to have been somewhat impaired the night before. He was eager to be gone, as he looked forward to a lively week in Carondelet Street, the financial and commercial center of New Orleans. Chopin's husband, Oscar, who worked as a cotton broker, moved his office to this prime location. Mr. B gave his wife half the money which he had brought away from Klein's hotel the evening before. She liked money as well as most women, and accepted it with no little satisfaction. "It will buy a handsome wedding present for Sister Janet," she exclaimed, smoothing out the bills as she counted them one by one. "Oh, we'll treat Sister Janet better than that, my dear," he laughed as he prepared to kiss her goodbye. The boys were tumbling about, clinging to his legs, imploring that numerous things be brought back to them. Mr. B was a great favorite, and ladies, men, children, even nurses, were always on hand to say goodbye to him. His wife stood smiling and waving, the boys shouting as he disappeared in the old Rockaway behind the sandy road. A few days later, a box arrived for Mrs. B from New Orleans. It was from her husband. It was filled with friandises, delicacies in French. Friandises, with luscious and toothsome bits, the finest of fruits, pâté, which filled pastries in French, a rare bottle of two delicious syrups, and bonbons in abundance. Mrs. B was always very generous with the contents of such a box. She was quite used to receiving them when away from home. The pâté and fruit were brought to the dining room, the bonbons were passed around, and the ladies, selecting with dainty and discriminating fingers and little greedily, all declared that Mr. B was the best husband in the world. Mrs. B was forced to admit that she knew of none better. Okay, that's the end of chapter 3. That's all I'm going to read right now. So, I hope this was enjoyable, and maybe you're interested in the rest of the book. But basically, it's just the setup